mais donc je vous passe la parole. Bonne discussion.
Merci beaucoup. I apologize that you appear to have traded down from the former Spanish foreign minister to me. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you. I've been promoted. My name is Yuri Lepstein. As Laura said, I'm the executive director of the Renew Democracy Initiative. We're an organization committed to defending democracy at home and confronting authoritarianism wherever it might arise. And I'm joined today, of course, by two people who can shed unique light on the state of our geopolitical situation, as well as the military stakes at play. I originally had an introduction ready for each of our guests, but I think everyone here knows them. And in the interest of time, I've just been told that the Polish Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, has provided us a video. And so perhaps we can just begin our conversation by hearing from him.
That is, wisdom comes to us only with hindsight. The German philosopher may have been right, especially in the case of intellectuals and politicians. What has been happening in Ukraine since February 24th proves two things. First, Russia has changed only its demeanor, not its heart. It is still a country which has not renounced its inclination for imperialism, nationalism, and colonialism. Ruski Mir, Putin's new ideology, is the same obsession that guided Stalin and Lenin. The same, only armed with more modern tools. Over the years, Western politicians and intellectuals have been unwilling to recognize the truth about Russia. Also in France, Russia had the face of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Tchaikovsky, whereas the real face of Russia is, unfortunately, the face of Putin, the face of the murderers from Irpin, Bucha, Mariupol. We live in the 21st century, and yet in Russia, not only has totalitarian regime been revived, but it has already formed a totalitarian society. The Ukrainian people, and this is my second thesis, did not make the mistake of Western intellectuals and politicians. Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, we have all lived in the shadow of imperial Russia for centuries. We can see its true nature very, very closely. Therefore, when Russia attacked Ukraine, it came as a surprise to the West, but not to Ukraine and the countries of the region. The Ukrainian miracle, the miracle performed by the hands of the Ukrainian nation, will certainly be the founding moment of a completely new history of Ukraine. Can we talk about the awakening of the nation? I think it is better to talk about a nation that has remained vigilant, that has never fallen asleep, that has not been fooled by tales of the end of history. It was not Ukraine that woke up. It was Europe that fell into a slumber. And today, Ukraine shows what Europe can be if it remains faithful to its values. No more war, no more totalitarianism. These slogans, guided by the builders of post-war Europe. Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke in Moscow about a generation that would never want to live under the nightmare of war, just before Russia's attack on Ukraine. Vladimir Putin reacted with mockery and laughter. The Russian president saw what European leaders refused to admit to themselves. He saw that the spirit that animated our continent just a few decades ago is weak. Fortunately, he could not see that this spirit was already living a new life in the Ukrainian nation. I know that nothing is more difficult than facing the truth. But the truth is that if Europe remains passive, the tide of totalitarianism can easily spread over the continent. Check and balance, the old rule of international politics, no longer applies. Because on the other side is not a politician who can be trusted, but a murderer and war criminal. Henry Kissinger said in Davos that Ukraine should give up part of its territory to Russia in order to restore peace. But Russia does not care about restoring peace. Russia only cares about expansion. If Ukraine had not defended Kiev, tomorrow Russian tanks would have attacked Vilnius, Helsinki, or Warsaw. The war won't end if we close our eyes. The West must win this war, or it will be completely marginalized. The main thing, the West can win this war. This is no longer Russia of its greatness. It is still a strong country, a very strong country, but much weaker than several dozen years ago. When the first bombs fell on Kiev on February 24th, hardly anyone believed that Ukraine could survive. But the Ukrainians proved that brute force is not everything. They proved that history is not a sentence for the weaker, and that faith and courage can stop even the greatest powers. I sometimes wonder what would happen if Henry Kissinger had been advising King Leonidas. He would probably say that it is not worth defending Sparta, that it is better to get along with the Persian Empire, because peace is the highest value. Yes, peace is extremely precious, but not peace at any cost, because freedom is the greatest European value. It was in the name of freedom that King Leonidas led 300 of his soldiers to stop the Eastern tyranny. He fell in this clash, but his sacrifice led to the unification of Greece and the defeat of Persia at the Battle of Plataea. Today, Ukraine is putting a dam against the flood of Eastern tyranny and defending European freedom. It defends its sovereignty and at the same time defends the sovereignty of Poland, Germany, or France. Does Ukraine have to fall for us to really unite and end pacts with Russia once and for all? It is true that Europe has already done a lot, but as long as the war continues, we must not rest. The heroism of the Ukrainian people awakened Europe and gave us the chance to build a better future. There is one condition: Europe must not fall asleep again.
Perhaps we can offer Europe some coffee. We're here, as everyone knows, to discuss the future of the transatlantic alliance in light of Vladimir Putin's horrific invasion of Ukraine and NATO members' joint response to Russia's aggression. While NATO countries displayed more force and unity than Putin expected, there are still questions about whether they're doing enough to ensure Ukraine's victory against a well-armed foe, and whether we can remain united over time, especially as inflation, high gas prices, war fatigue take their toll. Meanwhile, dictators, of course, don't sit on their laurels. And while we might be focused on Russia, the free world still faces threats from China, North Korea, Iran, and others. So we have a lot to cover. General Mattis, why don't we start with you? Russia's invasion of Ukraine has captured the attention of the Western world. We are witnessing massive global assistance for Ukraine. We're seeing Europe taking another look at its energy future, and new countries are pursuing NATO membership. Can you help us understand the moment we're in? How significant is this conflict? And what does it mean for the geopolitical order?
Well, thank you all for having me here. What it means is we can gather in peace and have an open discussion right now here on this side of the fighting. Meanwhile, they do not see the same sort of freedom in Moscow right now. A Russian speaker in Ukraine has more freedom of speech than a Russian speaker in Moscow does. There's a lesson in there. But I also just want to back off and look a little more broadly at this for a minute and just say it's just wonderful to join you here. Normandy is hallowed ground to Americans for a couple reasons. One is a couple miles away are those beaches where the democracy's armies demonstrated their awesome determination that once aroused, democracies will defend what we value very clearly. And by the way, Some carried British-made guns, some carried Belgian-made guns, some carried American-made guns, and they all knew what they had to do, and it did not stop us from fighting together because we had some different equipment out there. Not to worry about that in the alliance we have today. It's also hallowed ground because of what Alexis de Tocqueville found in his youth back a couple hundred years ago now, nearly, and writing with very penetrating insights into what motivates and what makes these experiments work, the ones you and I call democracies, and that's all they are, is experiments. And we're here to talk today about how to ensure our experiments do not fail. And in science, in hostile laboratories where you unleash antibodies, sometimes experiments can fail. But we're also judged much by how we handle the most difficult crises in our personal lives, in our nation's lives, in our corporate lives. And wars have a way of being an auditor, of stripping away the veneer that's over all of us and revealing, for better or worse, our character. And I would just make a couple points up front because we're here talking about an alliance. To the Admiral and I, we're both naval officers, and we look at blue space on maps not as obstacles, not as any problems. They are conduits of information, of commerce. There's ways to share ideas. I was happy, eager to fly over this bridge called the Atlantic to come over here because we shared service, the Admiral and I. Admiral Edward and I were both NATO officers. Now, that didn't mean we didn't serve our own nations. Of course we did. But we were alliance officers. We were united. We could walk into each other's command posts and look across the way and nod to one another, and a million words were exchanged in that one nod. I want you all to remember that as people start getting into trying to define what are the problems that we confront right now. I would also say that because we're doing this on the second day, Edward and I do not have to repeat all the great analysis we have heard all day yesterday, and with which we are probably at least 90% in agreement with everything. Pierre, once in a while you throw one at us that we wonder about, but we're still with you, my friend, all the way. Suffice to say, right now we're reminded of our duty really to the next generation. That's what our duty is. Are we going to turn over the same freedoms intact to the next generation that were given to us by the sacrifice and the conviction and the alliance that others that went before us were willing to turn over to us in good condition? That is, we were born or immigrated into these democracies of our own free will. But that carries with it a responsibility to turn over the freedoms to the next generation intact. That is not something we can shy away from and still look ourselves in the mirror and not have to turn away in disgrace. I think, too, it's going to take the blood, sweat, and tears that a former leader of one of our nations said it was going to take. And yes, for some of us, it's going to cost us our euros and our dollars as well, to include 150 euros to fill our gas tank to drive to Normandy, to this beautiful corner of France. We should remember, though, what my bride of all of 2 weeks, yes, recently married, I would just tell you, she reminds me that democracy is not a spectator sport, that we have each a responsibility here. So as we talk about what our leaders should be doing, we should also be speaking to ourselves. In this time, we see sovereign challenges around the world. We shouldn't mistake that Putin right now has been cataloged in numerous ways here over the last 24 hours with what he's doing to violate the sovereignty, whether it be of Germany or of the UK, mucking around in French or American elections. He has been doing it now most dramatically and most murderously in the Ukraine. But the same thing is going on with China in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. We've seen the terrorists do it, violating sovereignty. And sovereignty is a key issue in what we're looking at here right now. Most tragic and revealing, as the Polish Prime Minister just said, in Ukraine. But as an auditor of armies and of nations, this war is going to reveal for us exactly, for better or worse, what we stand for. And we're going to have to look to the ways these kind of challenges were addressed in our past, because there are solutions there that we can see. President Zelensky standing up valiantly, exhausted, orchestrating and inspiring the Ukrainian people. We see Jens Stoltenberg, our Secretary General of NATO, now on his third extension. Thank God he stayed around for this, who has held NATO together through very difficult internal and external pressures. We have seen Ursula von der Leyen, someone who has nothing but her persuasive power. She has no national podium or power base, and yet encouraging us to take the stand that she knows we must take in these days. And these are leaders who are carrying out a leader's number one responsibility for an alliance, and that is to define reality. You cannot live in a dream world. You must define the reality and do what is required. You can't say, well, I did my best. I was a leader, I did my best, and then I go to sleep. No, if you're saying that, then you're saying, I'm not going to do what is required today and stay awake and do it right now. You cannot get away with just doing your best as a leader. I think we see in Putin a creature straight out of Dostoevsky. He sees Russia surrounded by nightmares. He's been very well documented in the last couple of days. I won't waste time on that, repeating what I've heard. But certainly, I think that his fear of democracy is palpable. There's something Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in On Democracy about this, irrelevant today as it was in 1831, when as a young man he wrote it for all of us. He said there that the Anglo-American, and I would only plug in all democracies, gives free scope to the unguided exertions and common sense of the citizens. The Russian centers all authority of society in a single arm. The principal instrument of democracy is freedom. The principal instrument of Russia is servitude. He's just summed it up right there, what we face right now, today, in 2022. So the battle is joined today in the Ukraine between freedom and servitude, and in this seminal challenge of our times. His strategic folly has been well demonstrated. Putin's strategic folly has been well demonstrated. You don't have Finland and Sweden joining NATO without showing just how stupid it was to initiate this unneeded war. His operationally stupid approach has been revealed to the entire world as his pathetic army has tactically performed very poorly. And economically, I think that as long as the democracies do not lose heart, he has lost the European energy market share forever. He has doomed it for Russia so long as we hold together. He must be stopped, and the alliance is the primary tool. It is fit for its time. It must be adjusted. It must be adapted to the specific threat, but it is fit as it should be. And we must play this ball where it lies right now. Looking back and saying we missed something, we didn't realize reality, we denied reality, maybe so, maybe not. 2008, NATO in the multiple futures document said a resurgent Russia was a potential enemy for NATO, a threat to NATO. In 2018, which was 4 years ago, the United States changed its entire national defense strategy to recognize great power competition with China and with Russia, but we didn't follow through on it, and now we're going to have to shoulder aside the geoeconomic approach we had before and replace with the geopolitical aspects that have now basically come trumpeting in through the bombing of Kiev and other places. And out of this forge, you see actually what Putin is doing is forging a stronger NATO and a stronger European Union, so long as we don't lose our faith in one another. We wanted to use diplomacy. Putin said, I don't care, and he simply ignored it. And so we are going to now have to replace in the forefront, diplomacy is going to have to be replaced with deterrence. We are going to have to be able to deter him. And with President Xi and President Putin now having in their words and deeds welded together the Indo-Pacific with the Euro-Atlantic theaters, we are going to have to confront that. And I think NATO showed that, the willingness to do so here in Madrid, and certainly the lines are drawn on that. But we are going to have to turn our back on these last dishonest decades and confront reality now, and simply get over looking backwards and condemning who missed this or that. Once in a while, I love reading history because it tells me how other men and women dealt successfully or unsuccessfully with past similar problems. And I found a speech by Walter Lippmann, 1940. He's talking to his 1910 graduating class from Yale College in America, 1940. Think what was happening right here in 1940. And he writes, or he spoke, he said, "Upon the standard to which the good and honest will now repair, it is written, you have lived life the easy way. Henceforth you will live the hard way. You came into a great heritage made by the insight and the sweat and the blood of inspired and devoted and courageous men and women. Thoughtlessly and in utmost self-indulgence, you have all but squandered this inheritance. Now, only by the heroic virtues that made this inheritance can you restore it once again. You took the good things for granted, now you must earn them again. For every right that you cherish, you have a duty which you must fulfill. For every hope that you entertain, you have a task that you must perform. And for every good that you wish to preserve, you have to sacrifice your comfort and your ease. There is nothing for nothing any longer." I think the sooner we come to grips with that reality and realize NATO is the primary tool for banding together as democracies did on these beaches a few years ago, the sooner we do that, the better it is for the next generation. Over to you, sir.
So with that introduction, I want to see if I can foment some discussion about the NATO alliance and the extent to which it remains fit to purpose and the extent to which changes should be wrought. So Admiral Gyud, when you and I were chatting the other day, you mentioned that the US and European nations, looked at NATO differently because the US is an island and Europe obviously isn't. So as a very basic question, what do you see the NATO alliance being for?
Je crois qu'il ne faut pas se tromper sur ce qu'est l'Alliance Atlantique. Ça n'est pas une alliance politique, c'est une alliance militaire dont le but est de faire la guerre et de repousser les ennemis. Et comme toute alliance, ça a quelques vertus et puis quelques défauts. La première des vertus, c'est un échange de services. Je t'aide, tu m'aides. Et ça, on le voit bien, c'est face à un ennemi commun, ce qui veut dire déjà que nous avons identifié le même ennemi. Et c'est ce qui vient d'être fait, enfin, à Madrid, en disant que c'était bien la Russie et que le deuxième défi, donc c'est une deuxième priorité, c'est la Chine. Une alliance, c'est aussi la recherche permanente d'un compromis, parce qu'il faut se mettre d'accord sur la décision que l'on va prendre. Et comme vous l'imaginez, un compromis à 30, c'est plus compliqué qu'à 9 au moment de la création en 1949. Ce sera encore un peu plus compliqué quand la Suède et la Finlande auront rejoint. C'est un travail de tous les jours. La Turquie nous le prouve tous les jours, tous les jours, tous les jours. J'observe d'ailleurs que dans l'Alliance Atlantique, le seul empire, c'est la Turquie. Car la Turquie de M. Erdogan se voit comme une résurgence de l'Empire ottoman. Une alliance, c'est aussi la sérénité, parce que quand vous êtes alliés et que vous vous sentez collectivement protégé, vous pouvez faire d'autres choses et vous consacrer au bien public, au développement du commerce, au développement de tout, y compris les aspects sociaux. C'est aussi une connaissance mutuelle améliorée. Alors on peut toujours faire des progrès, et puis les jeunes générations doivent apprendre, elles aussi. Et puis surtout, et Jim y a fait un tout petit peu référence tout à l'heure, ce sont des méthodes de travail communes. Alors j'en parle d'autant plus volontiers que Jim a été le premier Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. Hier en 2010, non, 8, 10
2007 to 10.
2007 to
Turned
10.
it over to a French general.
Grâce à lui. Mais on y reviendra. À l'inverse, une alliance, ça présente un certain nombre de contraintes. Et c'est pour ça qu'il faut se méfier, ne pas comparer l'OTAN et l'Union européenne. Ça n'a rien à voir. Ça n'a strictement rien à voir, on ne parle pas de la même chose. La première contrainte, c'est bien sûr la réactivité face à l'arrivée de l'improbable. Même si les services de renseignement américains et britanniques avaient bien vu la possibilité et même la quasi-certitude d'une offensive russe, les autres services en Europe, dont les Français ne l'avaient pas vu, il faut quand même le reconnaître, mais ensuite il faut réagir très vite. Et là, on se retrouve de nouveau confronté au nombre. J'ai déjà parlé du consensus. Toute décision au sein de l'OTAN se prend par consensus. C'est un autre mot pour dire unanimité. C'est aussi une autre façon de dire, je vais faire exprès de prendre un exemple caricatural, que le Luxembourg peut tout bloquer. Ou que l'Islande, qui n'a pas de forces armées, peut également tout bloquer. L'Islande doit voter oui. Et donc ça peut prendre du temps. Il ne faut pas l'oublier non plus. Et puis une alliance, ça a un autre défaut, et c'est un défaut dans lequel les Européens sont tombés pendant plus de 30 ans. Ils sont tombés au moins depuis 1991, c'est-à-dire depuis vraiment la chute, l'implosion de l'Union soviétique. C'est que, on se dit, c'est l'autre qui va faire. L'autre s'appelant en général les États-Unis. Depuis 1991, seuls 2 pays en dehors des États-Unis ont continué à faire des efforts, insuffisants, et je le reconnais volontiers. Ce sont dans l'ordre des efforts, dans l'ordre d'importance des efforts, décroissants, le Royaume-Uni et la France. On parlait tout à l'heure, c'était Andrew qui parlait tout à l'heure de 1,54%, ça représente quoi de dépenses militaires? Oui, et c'était même descendu dans certains grands pays européens à 0,8, 0,9%. Donc absolument ridicule. Et je le dis en tant qu'ancien chef d'état-major des armées, c'était ridicule. En France, nous sommes descendus très bas, on remonte. J'aimerais qu'on monte beaucoup plus. Enfin, l'OTAN, ne pas l'oublier, c'est un grand pays, plus de 300 millions d'habitants, les États-Unis. C'est 8 pays de taille moyenne, hein, je compte bien sûr le Canada et la Turquie, entre 30 et 85 millions d'habitants, ce qui veut dire un produit intérieur brut adapté à ça, et des forces armées adaptées à ça. Et puis les 21 autres, ils ont moins de 30 millions d'habitants. Alors certains ont quelques centaines de milliers d'habitants, évidemment je pense au Luxembourg. Et comme vous imaginez, vous ne pouvez pas demander la même chose, y compris en termes de réflexion stratégique, à des pays qui ont de toutes petites armées, qui sont totalement enclavés, ou à des pays qui ont une façade maritime, et nous venons effectivement de la haute mer tous les deux, qui ont une façade maritime et qui ont donc une vision, qui ont plus aisément, plus naturellement, une vision globale. Enfin, un dernier point, avant d'aborder la question de l'île monde, même pour reprendre certains stratèges américains, l'idée de certains stratèges américains, n'oubliez pas, l'OTAN n'a pas de troupes en soi. L'OTAN utilise conjointement des troupes fournies par les États membres. Il est, à part les AWACS, les avions radars, vous savez, qui surveillent le ciel, qui eux appartiennent réellement pour le coup à l'OTAN, et à part un bateau de recherche océanographique et puis 2 ou 3 petites choses, non, il n'y a pas d'armée de l'OTAN. C'est d'ailleurs la raison pour laquelle je ne vois pas pourquoi il y aurait une armée européenne. Mais ça, on peut y revenir si vous le souhaitez, parce que c'est vraiment ce que j'appelle une fake news, l'armée européenne. Alors je n'engage que moi-même en disant ça, je n'engage pas, comme vous l'imaginez, le gouvernement français. L'OTAN a donc un problème qu'elle arrive à régler en général de perception de la menace. Et quand vous êtes les États-Unis et le Canada, ça forme une grande île, vous avez d'un côté le Pacifique, de l'autre les États-Unis, et donc vous n'avez pas de jonction territoriale avec l'ennemi potentiel. Et donc vous n'avez pas du tout la même perception de ce que j'appellerais la cinétique des menaces. Les Polonais, et on l'a vu avec la déclaration du Premier ministre polonais, eux qui ont une frontière directe, pour eux c'est pas demain matin, c'est dans 1 heure, c'est dans 10 minutes. Et donc forcément, vous n'avez pas exactement la même perception. Or la première chose à avoir, c'est une perception, non pas la même, mais une perception de la menace qui soit partagée. Quand vous aurez une perception, ce qu'on a maintenant dans le temps, quand vous avez une perception de la menace qui est partagée, à ce moment-là, vous pouvez mettre en place, et c'est l'intérêt de l'OTAN justement, une stratégie ou des modes opératoires partagés. Et vous savez que l'OTAN, c'est 3 choses en fait. C'est un secrétariat général et le Conseil de l'Atlantique Nord, à base d'ambassadeurs, et Mme Baird hier appartenait à cet organisme, ce sont des civils. Et ensuite, ce sont 2 commandements militaires, l'un qui s'appelle SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, qui est basé à Mons, en Belgique, Et puis l'autre, qui est basé à Norfolk, Virginia, qui est Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. Et le deuxième, aujourd'hui, paradoxalement, est plus important que le premier. Pourquoi? Parce que c'est le deuxième qui détermine les normes communes, les critères d'emploi, les types d'entraînement, les expérimentations à faire. Or, si nous devons un jour, imaginons le pire, que la dissuasion nucléaire ne fonctionne pas et qu'on se batte contre l'armée russe, ce n'est pas un seul pays qui se battrait, c'est plusieurs pays. Et si vous voulez que ça ait l'effet d'un seul, et pluribus unum, on y revient. Il faut bien pouvoir être